that he's really
Oh my
earnest.
god, yeah.
Yeah.
It's
No,
scary.
it's volcanic.
Can I ask a quick logistical question? Are you guys getting off the stage?
Hmm?
Are you guys getting off the stage?
I'm sorry? Who, right now?
How are you getting off the stage?
How am I getting off the stage?
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
probably,
On foot.
I have 6 eunuchs who are gonna put me in one of those things, and they're gonna bear me on their shoulders, and they're gonna bring me over here, and they're gonna lift me off. and
Is
put
that
me
why
on the-
that crew is here? There is a.
That's right.
I should have known, but I mean, like.
I'm just gonna walk over here.
Walk off.
You'll do the glasses first, then pick up the cello, then get the bow.
Is that how you practice at home?
Listen, when you're in these kind of high pressure things, it's really good to just plan everything, so that embarrassment does not ensue.
Here for the first time, welcome. We're so pleased to have you here for this conference on Reawakening the Spirit of Democracy. A couple of housekeeping notes. If you are new here, first and foremost, many of our panelists for this afternoon's sessions and from this morning's sessions have books outside, so if you're interested in picking up a copy of their book, I know that they would be delighted, as would the Ivy Bookshop, but it's a great way to continue learning more about the topics that we're discussing today. Additionally, with the exception of the musical selection that we're about to hear, all of our panels will have an opportunity for audience members to contribute their own questions, to be a part of the conversation, and the URL can be found on the screens for those conversations. I'll probably get up several more times to remind you of that, but anyway. So what I want to do today or what I want to do next is introduce our next feature, which isn't something you typically see at a conference of the sort that we're doing, but since the conference today is taking place in the heart of Hopkins' own Peabody Conservatory, we thought it would be fitting to start the afternoon session with a musical reflection on democracy. Music, as do many forms of the arts, has a way of reaching across the aisle, past divides. It can bring people together, and it can serve as a vehicle to create dialogue. And so we thought it was fitting to have this to start the afternoon session. So let me now welcome Michael Cannon. He's Peabody Conservatory's Sidney Freiberg Chair in Chamber Music, and he's going to give you a little bit of context for today's musical selection.
Thank you. We are here today to contribute by bringing to you Beethoven. Ludwig van Beethoven was a man who was deeply engaged with the political and philosophical currents of his day. Born in 1770 and dying in 1827, his lifetime included the American and French revolutions, and he was a firm believer in the Enlightenment ideals that animated both of those two historical events. He believed that great majesty was to be found most of all in the common man. He rejected the notion of the divine right of kings. He argued ceaselessly for equality and justice for all men. More than any other composer, and I would say more than almost any other artist of any sort, Beethoven expressed in his music what it is to be human and why every person is deserving of dignity. Much of his music deals overtly with these themes. For example, his only opera, Fidelio, is the story of an unjustly accused political prisoner who is eventually led from darkness to light through love and fidelity. And this opera includes choruses of political prisoners singing of freedom. Another example is Beethoven's Third Symphony, which we now call the Eroica Symphony, and which was famously first dedicated to Napoleon. Beethoven's enthusiasm for the French Revolution was such that he dedicated this new and revolutionary symphony to him. But once Beethoven learned that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor, he scratched out that dedication. In fact, this act of political outrage can still be seen if you look at the original manuscript of that piece. You can see how he crossed out Napoleon's name. Perhaps most movingly of all, we hear Beethoven's plea for equality and brotherhood in the great finale of his Ninth Symphony. That movement begins with this simple, like almost simplistic little melody that we all know and we can all hum, right? Bum, 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 bum. What could be more simple? But from this humble melody is built the giant edifice of that monumental movement, a musical icon that has, since its composition, found its way to be performed at some of the most important political moments in history, like at the Berlin Wall after its fall. This piece has taken such an important place in our world culture that it is registered in UNESCO's Memory of the World Register as a universal symbol of peace between all nations and among all people. It is a vivid musical representation of Beethoven's belief that the grandest things are built from the most humble of origins. The three works that I just mentioned are big, sort of giant public pieces, public outpourings. But Beethoven looked to these themes in some of his most intimate and personal works as well. Today, we offer such a piece, the great slow movement from one of his most famous chamber works, the piano trio in B-flat, opus 97, known as the Archduke Trio. This profound piece was written at a time of great personal crisis for Beethoven, and it rests on the cusp of what we now call his late period, a period during which he created some of the most visionary, cosmic music the world has ever known. Music filled with the deepest humanity and the loftiest spirituality. This movement, like the finale of the Ninth Symphony, is what we call a theme with variations. This musical form is what its name suggests. A theme is put forth, and then that theme is elaborated upon, altered, embellished, transformed. In Beethoven's late period, the theme and variation form became the quintessential vehicle for the expression of his ideas, for it is so beautifully suited to the expression of how something transforms from one thing into another thing, an idea that Beethoven was extremely interested in. The transformation from the humble to the exalted, from the earthly to the heavenly, from the human to the divine. In the movement we play today, we first hear a little dance, very slow and infinitely tender, first sung by the piano and then joined by the strings. From this theme unfolds a series of variations. Now, to my ears, there are two types of variations here. The first type of variation expresses the deeply human, humorous, playful, grounded. The other type expresses the spiritual, the ineffable, the lofty. The variations kind of alternate between these two types. And then, towards the end of the movement, comes a moment of magic, kind of a miracle, really. After the music hovers and almost comes to a full stop, there is a moment of exaltation. And these two types of expression somehow merge. They subsume into each other to produce a third thing, the perfect combination of the human and the spiritual. Beethoven knew that these were the essential two sides of all of us. To be fully human, one cannot exist without both. The movement comes to an end with achingly beautiful music, clearly reminiscent of the original tender theme, but exalted to a higher plane. Once again, Beethoven has shown us that this divine spark lives in all of us, and therefore, each one of us is deserving of justice, equality, and freedom. Perhaps you will hear all of this. Perhaps you will hear something completely different. It's not important. It doesn't matter. But if you listen carefully, you will be rewarded with an uplifting, transcendental experience. We are once again indebted to Beethoven for inspiring us to our best selves as he urges us toward a world grounded in brotherhood and sisterhood. The slow movement of Beethoven's Archduke Trio.
Thank you. What a wonderful way to start our afternoon. I'd like to now welcome to the stage the chairman of the Renew Democracy Initiative and our collaborator on this conference today, Gary Kasparov. The Renew Democracy Initiative's mission is to protect and promote democratic values and individual freedom in the U.S. and around the world. They're also committed to ensuring that the leaders of tomorrow, that's you students who are in the room, are well equipped to take on this mantle. Gary and his team have been instrumental in helping to put this day together, and it's with great pleasure that I now welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. My deep appreciation for our host, Johns Hopkins University, and its president, Ron Daniels, and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Democracy is always in need of friends, and they are steadfast. It's been a little over 2 years since a few friends and I got together in New York City to discuss what we might be able to do to address the modern crisis of liberal democracy. We understood that although the moment was catalyzed by the election of Donald Trump, he was only a symptom of a disease that had been spreading for many years. The Renew Democracy Initiative is an attempt to find a cure. Authoritarian regimes like Russia and China have become openly dictatorial at home and more aggressively abroad. Fragile republics like Hungary and Turkey have shifted to demagoguery and autocracy. Populists rule in Italy, while fascists and socialists have made gains across much of Europe. Bellwether democracies like Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States are struggling with populism, xenophobia, and the rise of ideological extremism on the right and on the left. Perhaps the most concerning of all, the basic principles of liberal democracy, the individual freedom, the guaranteed rights, are under attack like never before. Civil disagreement has given way to contempt, to open hatred. I've been forced to leave my home twice in my life. My family and I fled my birthplace of Baku, Azerbaijan, in the deep south of the USSR, when violent anti-Armenian pogroms began in 1990. In 2013, I realized I could no longer return safely to Vladimir Putin's Russia, where my opposition colleagues were being harassed, persecuted, and murdered with impunity. It's easy to say such things could never happen here in the United States, as the saying goes. The democratic institutions here are far stronger than those of the fragile, young Russian ones destroyed so completely by Putin. But decay does not happen overnight. It does not begin with weak institutions or a corrupt executive. Those are the effects that reveal how weak the system has already become. It's the result of years, even decades of complacency, a shift in values, the abandonment of principles. It's a direct consequence of a steady decline in the responsibilities of being a member of a democracy and of being a democratic nation in the world. The Renew Democracy Initiative is dedicated to fighting back against that tide. As we did with our first project, the book Fight for Liberty, modeled on the Federalist Papers, RDI wants to educate those who have never learned about why democracy really matters, and to remind the many who have forgotten. We want to inspire a new generation to believe in the power of individual freedom and of free societies to create unrivaled prosperity and opportunity. We must not, this is never to say that America is or has ever been perfect. We must not whitewash our flaws if we hope to fix them. America's strength has always been its ability to get better. And while it has recently taken a few steps back, we do say that America remains the best hope of revitalizing the spirit of democracy in the world. And to do that, it must lead by example. We understand that our emphasis on education and civics may sound too slow in a time of crisis. And I admit, I do consider myself someone who places a priority on thinking several moves ahead. But we do not shy away from the battles of the day. Our members advocate and agitate in lectures, op-eds, backrooms, boardrooms, and classrooms. We read books, we write books, but we also march in the streets and tweet, probably too much. We also know that a rush for short-term solutions will only make the problem worse. Extremism must not be met by equal opposite extremism. Despite what you might see on cable news, there is a room in the middle. There's a room for respect, for cooperation, even for sanity. We must fight to defend that space and to expand it. We must use the moment to spark a rebirth of active and engaged citizenship. This must be a wake-up call for American democracy, not a death knell. As we begin our next session of discussions on disinformation, it's essential to remember that listening is not enough. We are here today in a temple of knowledge, a majestic library in a hallowed place of teaching and learning. But today, it must be also a place of action. Apathy and ignorance are not the only threats to the values of democracy today. They are under active attacks from the forces of dictatorship, of demagoguery, and corruption, and hate. If those attacks are not countered, we will have proved ourselves unworthy of the mantle of freedom. We will also have failed to defend those most in need of the protections and benefits of democracy and rights. Do not be afraid. Do not be intimidated into silence, not by your enemies or even your allies, or you will soon lose the right to speak at all. Please, I have lived through it twice, in the Soviet Union and in Putin's Russia, and I do not want there to be a third time. This wonderful conference is a spark, and we need your help to fan it into a flame. Go to rdi.org and join the Renew Democracy Initiative. Spread the word online and off. Most importantly, spread the values you believe in. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks again to the Renew Democracy Initiative for being a great partner in this conference today. I'm now pleased to welcome to the stage our fifth panel of the day to talk about disinformation and democracy. We've heard this talked about a little bit throughout the day, and now we're going to really get into it. The panel will be moderated by Washington Post columnist and future member of the SNF Agora Institute, Ann Applebaum. And joining Ann will be Graham Brookie, Director and Managing Editor of the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council, Evelyn Farkas, Resident Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and Edward Lucas, Senior Vice President, the Center for European Analysis. As a reminder, I know y'all are tired of hearing me say this, but at the end of the panel, we will have time for audience questions. So as they come up in your minds during the panel, please reference the screens here. You can see the URL to which you can submit those questions. And at this point, I'd like to turn the panel over to Ann. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we've heard references to this topic today in some of the earlier panels and as well as last night. But I would like to begin by cautioning you not to treat this subject as if it were something particularly connected to the 2016 elections and particularly connected to the Russians. Edward Lucas and I had been following Russian propaganda and working on it for many years before that happened, as I believe were you, and you would have known as well. And we all knew that the Russians were developing this technology and this way of thinking about manipulating the internet. But I think one of the things that we've learned since the 2016 elections is that many of the techniques and tactics that the Russians pioneered can be and are being used in all kinds of other places by all kinds of other people in other countries by domestic actors. The impact of the flood of disinformation on everybody's politics in almost every country in the world is something that I don't think you can underestimate it. I think of it something like, I believe we're living through a real information revolution. Almost the best comparison that I can come up with is the invention of the printing press, the radical 15th century technology that completely changed the way that people read and understood information. And it had fantastic effects. It meant that people became literate, books spread, education became popularized, it became possible for millions of people to read and write. But it also undermined the establishment of the time, which was the Catholic Church and the monasteries, and it led to 100 years of religious wars in Europe. And it was really only when we came to the ideas of religious tolerance a few hundred years later that we began to put society back together again once it was, as it was. And, the kind of, the polarization that has been created both by the nature of the platforms and by people deliberately seeking to undermine it and deepen it is something that everybody is feeling in every democracy. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have the intense political change everywhere that we have today. So on this panel, we're going to talk a little bit about first what it is and what it's become, because again, I don't think it's just fake Facebook pages anymore. I work on a project at the London School of Economics, which has spent a lot of time trying to understand how domestic and foreign actors work together online, how something called, we call the international alt-right, which has members in many countries, coordinates messages across borders. We've looked at the proliferation of websites of a new kind, which you can now very easily create many dozens of fake or phony websites that give different kinds of information, which then reflect upon one another. And the point is that it's a set of technologies that is changing all the time and taking on new forms. So we'll spend a couple of minutes talking about that, and then I want to get to rather rapidly the question of solutions, because there are a lot of people who've begun thinking about this. Some of them are on this panel. There isn't going to be one solution. There are going to be several, and I'm really happy that we have represented here a journalist or a former journalist. We have an NGO in Graham and a former government official, because it's really from all these different kinds of institutions and organizations that we're going to eventually get to some solutions. So why don't I start with Graham, who runs an organization called DFR Lab, or a page called DFR Lab. Yeah. And maybe you could explain a little bit what it is so that the audience knows, and then also how are you seeing disinformation changing? What does it look like now?
Right. So thank you, and thank you all for coming today. We have a lot to pack into an hour, and I'm sure that we'll solve all of the foreign influence that happens in elections and in disinformation online. So let's get right to it. The Digital Forensic Research Lab, as Anne mentioned, is a center that is housed at the Atlantic Council, but it's a startup that is designed to do three things: identify, expose, and explain disinformation, with an emphasis on explaining disinformation. And the reason why we emphasize explaining as opposed to identifying and exposing is because we want to not just play whack-a-mole and fact-check every single thing that we see on the internet, but use each case study that we're looking at to explain how it works. So what is the beginning and middle and end of a story? Who are the actors involved? What are the tactics and behaviors over time that we see? And frankly, like whether it mattered, right? Whether it reached an audience. And so the way that we do that is by using open source research. And open source research means that we won't publish anything, or we won't use any sources that you don't have access to on your phone, right? And so the reason for that is because sitting at a think tank in DC, we don't want to assume our own credibility. So if we're monitoring elections in a place like Brazil or in a place like Poland or Germany, we don't want to show up and say, okay, well, we're a think tank that happens to be in DC, and you should trust us because we're a think tank in DC. The whole point is to get around that and say, don't trust us, look at all of these sources, and lift up as much objective information as possible, and let folks decide for themselves. That being said, just in terms of framing a discussion around kind of where we're actually looking at and tactics that we've seen over time, the bad news is that bad actors are getting more sophisticated. So using 2018 midterms here in the United States, just as an example, you didn't see as many kind of crazy botnets that are reaching thousands of people, automated things online. But what we did see was a shift in focus to say, okay, well, we're going to target smaller groups of more engaged people activist communities, because the point of disinformation is to drive people further away rather than closer together. And in a political system,
I specifically use the word polarization because it acts on and deepens, but also uses polarization. And so all the research shows that it's the most polarized audiences that are the most susceptible to disinformation.
And so one of the things that we've seen over time, especially since 2016, where bad actors, specifically Russia in this case, reached very large general audiences, is a shift in tactics because of increased scrutiny. So the good news is that there's increased scrutiny because rooms like this are more aware of this problem. But the bad news is they're focusing on more kind of highly engaged, narrowly tailored groups that are on further ends of each side of the political spectrum. And they've been really, really good at that, especially in 2018. So there's a meme that says they set out, but really they're just shifting tactics over time. A quick point, at the DFR lab, we don't use the term fake news anymore. So let's throw it out for this conversation. It comes with a lot of connotations and baggage. It's not a particularly good research term. But we do use the term disinformation, which means the spread of false information with intent. It means somebody meant to go do that. Or misinformation, which is the spread of false information without intent, which is like my uncle sending things without actually reading it before he does that, which I wish he would stop doing.
But isn't there another level now too as well? Yes. Isn't there another level now too as well, which is campaigns that are designed to create influence or create emotional reactions, which aren't even necessarily using false stories. I mean, you can use a real story. You know, for example, an immigrant has murdered a girl in Slovakia. I made that up, but and you could then have a campaign built around that story that is designed to make people angry and anti-immigrant, and that can then be manipulated by politicians. So that's another category. And you could then sort of amplify it using bots or using fake accounts.
Right, and I think that's one of the most important aspects of this is that we think about it because we spread truth, right? Because we use evidence in the arguments that we
try.
We're logical actors.
Yes.
Yeah, we try, and when we don't, we admit it. But this problem is not necessarily just solely based on uplifting objective information. It's an emotional problem, right? And so these narratives, whether they're true or not, whether they're disinformation or misinformation, are designed to prey on our emotional response to public debate. Mm-hmm. And that's a really scary thing in a democracy.
Yeah, and there are also ways in which the internet platforms have increased that problem, because as we all know now that Facebook prioritizes attention, so it wants people to stay on its page as long as possible. And one of the effects of that is that the more emotional and the more dramatic and often the more false things that you read are the things that you spend the most time reading.
Right.
And so the nature of the platform seems to be increasing that problem as well.
Well, their metrics of success are that specifically. You hit
right.
on it. And so their incentives are to have as many eyes on screens for as long as possible. And that's true across the entire information environment, right? So it's true on social media platforms, it's frankly true on websites. And the main metric of success for a social media company is a term that they would call a highly engaged community or a community of interest. So, taking an example outside of the disinformation debate, but like video gamers. Those guys spend more time doing that online, and that's a really, really highly engaged group. And so it means that it's a group that will drive up the metrics of a social media platform because they're always talking about that very specific thing. The same could be said of baseball fanatics or soccer fanatics while the World Cup is going on. That's going to be a highly engaged conversation, and that's going to drive up metrics of success, both growth in user base for social media companies and growth in actual content that's being spread.
Mm-hmm. Edward, you've spent some time thinking about the platforms, the structure of the internet, how it works, how it could be changed, how it could even conceivably be regulated. Do you want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yes. When we set up the internet, there were a lot of decisions made, mostly decisions not to do stuff. So it was based on the idea of convenience, of openness, backwards compatibility, something that has worked in the past should continue to work in the future. We never really thought at all about identity or navigation. You can when you get onto the internet, it's not like getting into your car where there's rules about, this is a road, this is not a road, this is a signpost. When you get into a car, there's a license plate on the car, there's a driver's license in your pocket, and so on. And we developed the internet with very little in the way of identity assurance, and not much when it comes to navigation assurance, knowing where you are. There are things called security certificates that tell you, does this site have certain software installed that should make it less likely you get robbed. But it's pretty much it's pretty loose, and there's ways around almost everything. So that means that I can set up a site, and I can call it annapplebaum.com. And I can just register it using, instead of the English E from the English alphabet or the English A, I use the Cyrillic one. So that's actually different numbers. All websites have letters that turn into numbers. And on that website, I can pretend to be you. I can issue condemnations, I can do whatever I want. It's not illegal. And I wouldn't want it to be illegal. It's good to be able to do parodies and so on. But I think that we need to shift the balance a bit in favor of people who are able to show that they're real, and in favor of sites that are able to demonstrate some degree of realness. I'm absolutely not against, and in some circumstances it's really important, if I'm doing Tibetan human rights or something, I want the best anonymity out there. I don't want the Chinese Communist Party hunting me down. But I think that there are techniques and things that are already out there. We're all probably familiar with the blue tick on Twitter. Now, I'm very frustrated. I've been having a bit of a campaign with Twitter at the moment, because I think that the blue tick should be one of the building blocks of an identity on the internet. The Anne Applebaum, or your husband, has a blue tick against his name. That shows people that's really him. There's another Twitter account with a very similar name, and that's not him. That's some Polish political parody account. That's fine. They're allowed to attack people, but there's a difference between the blue tick, which shows that someone's checked this is a real person, and someone's
not. But why can't everybody have a blue tick?
Well, I think it should be an option. If you, for example, do you have a landline? Okay, not everybody has a landline. A landline's a pretty good idea of a real person. Can you transfer a penny from a real bank account? If you have internet banking, here's an IBAN, international bank account number. From your phone, you can transfer money from real bank account. These things aren't absolutely bulletproof, and there are people who will find ways around them. But I think we need to have a kind of an identity ecology where you are able to prove with strong degrees of certainty that there's a real person. Because we don't allow people to go and write graffiti on walls. Very few places. There was a democracy wall in Prague under communism. I think the first time I met Anne, we actually went to look at it. And that's where Czech dissidents would determinedly go and write stuff up on the wall, and the communist authorities would whitewash them, and that was sort of graffiti as an act of protest. But on the whole, we don't conduct in the public square communication through graffiti and heckling.
And also, if someone walked in the room right now with a mask on his face, we wouldn't want to speak to him. We wouldn't think this person is
no, not necessarily. Yeah, I mean, there are certain. You have. If you go to Venice, you can go to a masked ball. Look, it's absolutely fine if you want to go.
But when we have political conversations, they're between real people. So why shouldn't that be?
So I think we need to shift the balance in favour of that. It should be possible to prove that you're a real person. It should be possible to ask the people you're dealing with, are they real? Are they real? And if you say, no, I don't want to do that, that's fine. We're not shutting you up, but we are privileging realness in political debate.
And one could also argue that we should also privilege, for example, it should be clear when you open a website, you should be able to find out who set it up, who created it, where the money comes from.
So for example,
and there's a similar argument, of course, about political advertising, and maybe even all advertising online. Well, you should be able to know who paid for it and where it came from.
Absolutely. So if you at the moment, I mean, if you remember the way the leaks came out into the American political system was through two websites called DC Leaks and USA Politics Today, and they were both quite well designed. And if you on a casual inspection, they would look like real news websites. But actually they weren't, and with a little bit of the sort of stuff that not your average internet user can do, but someone sort of with kind of basic literacy, you could see that they'd been registered effectively anonymously. The hosting was done in a way that no normal website would do. There was no street address, there's no phone number, there's no editorial code of ethics, there's no named people there. Now, if you go to the Washington Post or the Economist, where I used to work, it's really easy to find out our street address, the name of the editor, actually because we want to sell advertising, so we want people to buy subscriptions. So I think that when you go to a site, there should be some sort of indication of its realness. There should be,
But you're saying we should require this?
Well, I think you should give sites an easy way of showing they've got it. And in fact, you get this if you're very geeky on security. There's a way of measuring the strength of a site's security certificate. There's a browser plugin which can tell you, is the data that's going to this site properly encrypted? Is it coming back properly encrypted? So if you're on that rather narrow sense, we're already used to that. But I think there should be ways of giving, maybe a red, yellow, green thing on the realness of a site. Does it have letters to the editor? Does it ever publish corrections and apologies? I used to set this as a test for journalism students. Can you find the only time that RT has ever apologized? It was really hard. They did it just once. Since then, the test doesn't work anymore because they've now started doing more because they're trying to be real. But there's all sorts of tests you can apply, and we should, rather than having to test it ourselves, we should see whether people have complied with it.
But shouldn't those also, should realness be something that, that the Google algorithm should favor, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you, and I think the platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Google, most people don't type in links. They Google them or they find them on social media. And I think that it would be a responsible behavior from a platform that when you click on a link, just as it already says, Google will already say, watch out, this is a phishing site. It may try to steal your email in order to rob you. I think it would also be completely reasonable for the platforms to say, this site doesn't have any real-world credentials, or this site has limited real-world credentials, or this site has lots of real-world credentials. I would like to know that when I'm clicking, because it would encourage me to know whether I want to go further on.
And it would also help educate people about what it is that they're reading and why. Evelyn, you have worked in the government, and you have thought quite a lot about how we deal very specifically with foreign disinformation. I mean, some of the things we've been talking about are ways of, ways of trying to misinform people or influence people, which could be done by anybody, domestic actors, foreign actors. But should we treat foreign actors specially and differently? Is that, should we think differently about Russians or Chinese or Malaysians who are trying to shape our politics than we think about American groups who are maybe using the same tactics?
Yes. Yes, and I know you said at the outset you don't want this to be just about Russia, but I really think it's important for people to understand that it has to be first and foremost about Russia, and then we can talk about all the others, because we have yet to deter Russia. They're still continuing to do all of the things they were doing, and then some, or they've altered their methodology, but they are still continuing to attack our democracy, and we have yet to receive a definitive accounting from our politicians. So when I was invited to this, and I thank you, Johns Hopkins and RDI, for including me, I was asked, give the government perspective or talk about how the government
or what the government's perspective should be.
Right, and my big beef, which I think everyone in this room should have, is that the American government, and I would include the British government since we have a British colleague here who can agree or disagree, and many other governments have really fallen down just with simple transparency, explaining to the American people what happened. What happened in 2016, and then, of course, what's happening today. But if we fail to understand what the Russians did to us in 2016, what the Russians did with Brexit, what the Russians have done in a lot of other scenarios, we remain partially defenseless against the Russians. We don't have clarity of purpose. So that's my number one point, is that I feel that my government, the executive branch and the legislative branch, I worked in both branches, they are equally culpable for failing to provide sufficient awareness. So awareness is the number one thing. Number two is transparency. You guys already mentioned it, and that applies domestic and foreign. I don't think you need to make much of a distinction either on awareness or transparency. And I should also give credit. I have colleagues at the German Marshall Fund who are running the Securing Democracy initiative, and also a new initiative on digital democracy and innovation. So I have to give them credit, because some of these ideas have come from them.
There are a lot of, one of the, I think, just if I can interrupt, one of the points about this problem is that it's very profound, and it's going to have multiple solutions from different think tanks.
But I also mentioned the different think tanks, the Pell Center up at Salvia Regina. All these places have said all these things for years now. So again, getting back to awareness, transparency, and then what to do about it, they've all said a bunch of things. So for example, as you mentioned before, Anne, I think you need, or maybe Ed, when you have advertising on the internet, it should be no different from advertising on any other source of media. It should be labeled with the source right away. You shouldn't have to click anywhere or do something extra. And I think that gets to another point, which is in terms of transparency when it comes to social media, they should really be held accountable the same way regular media is. That means the legislators have to get in there and regulate. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that they haven't been regulated. And again, in part, it's because there's lack of awareness, lack of transparency on what these companies failed to do, how they covered up and are continuing to cover up to this day, frankly speaking. And without that, it's hard to say, okay, now we must do X. So I think that's an important area for policymakers. There also needs to be increased enforcement because a lot of these things, once you pass these laws, they also need to be enforced. And we've seen in other areas, not disinformation, but in the areas of corruption that were dealt with earlier today, our government, at least the US government, has failed to respond properly. Now, getting to specifically foreign actors, which was your question, these are malicious actors. So in the domestic context, it's sometimes hard. Like the idea of having Google say this is a good, credible news source and this one isn't, is very difficult in the American domestic context. You can fund groups like Agora, Johns Hopkins, think tanks, right? You can fund independent investigators, and they should be the best kind of crowdsourcing, information feed for that. But when it comes to foreign actors, the US government and other governments do need to take an active role in alerting the public, in alerting politicians, in alerting private sector, whether it's nonprofit or profit, that these foreign actors are attacking you. They're trying to use disinformation in order to essentially take you down one way or another.
Can I just push back on that for a little bit? So I did a little bit of work on the German elections. And one of the things last year, and one of the things that we found while looking at them was that it was actually not possible to distinguish between domestic German actors and Russian actors. They were using the same messages. They actually were meeting on closed Facebook groups where they exchanged ideas. They were doing the same things, and the Russian actors were essentially learning from this is the German far right mostly, a little bit the German far left, and they were learning from them and copying them and imitating them and then amplifying further. So I'm not sure that you could draw a line, in that case and say so easily anymore. And there's also more and more. There's a kind of international alt-right. I know that I was about to ask you about the irony. I know these international nationalists, who act together and function, Dutch, German, Swedish, American, Russian, they do very much of the same things. And I'm not sure it's going to be so easy to draw lines anymore. I mean, that's one of the nature of the internet.
But you can still say these foreign actors are coming in with this kind of malign content aimed at X
but
or
their
Y, or we don't
malign
know
content is the same content that's being used by Americans.
Right, but you don't. But if you're at the State Department and you're trying to alert public, private, American, and foreign governments that, let's say, Russia is trying to manipulate something in Thailand, so maybe it's not even in the US, you can still alert your allies and tell them. Or if it's in the US, you can alert the private sector that Russian bots are coming in and they're saying that carbonated beverages are really un-American, right? That's not unimaginable, actually. Right? So if the Russians came in and started that kind of campaign, sure, there would be Americans who would say, yeah, I don't like those sugary, substances either. But the reality, the fact that the Russians are engaged in that is something that Americans, public sector, private sector, regular citizens should know about.
So I think the problem here is that it shows that if you get focused too much on the content, you get very you go down a rabbit hole, really. And there's two different problems. One is you say, I don't like this content. Is it domestic or is it foreign? The point is, there's something obnoxious about the content or the way that it's being delivered. And then there's a second question about whether this content is so obnoxious that it is somehow breaking the rules. And then you get into other arguments about, is this kind of protected political speech? And I think for those two reasons, it's better not to focus on the content.
I agree with
but focus much more on the vector. Where's this coming from? So
how is it arriving?
If this is a site that pretends to be a news site that isn't, if this is a social media account which pretends to be a real person but doesn't have any real person characteristics. Those are the things to worry about before you start worrying about is it a malign domestic or malign foreign actor.
Yep.
I'm taking the microphone back because I know she wants to go to Graham. But two more things. Voice of America, Radio Free Europe. America also needs to keep the lead on correcting the message internationally. So we need to put more money into that. Michelle mentioned last night, her terminology was sort of a new USAID. It doesn't matter what you call it, digital USAID. She said, we need to do a better job working with our allies to get the truth out there and react more quickly.
We also need to make sure we still have allies. Yeah.
Right, and then the last thing, of course, it was mentioned also by Senator Heitkamp last night, but educating our public. You know, democracy only works if you have an educated public, and I think getting back to the point you made in the very beginning, what we have with this new technology is a democratization or a popularization of democracy, right? A further one. Donna Bazile talked about it also happening within the Democratic Party with the delegates, with you don't have super delegates who are the elites. We still have an electoral college, we still have a Supreme Court, we still have these parts of our democracy that are aristocratic, if you will, if you read John Lukasz's book about democracy and populism. So I think we need to be aware, if we're going to try to further democratize, further popularize our democracy with this kind of social media, then we need to be able to step in and educate our public better.
Yeah, so Graham, you spend, probably of all the four of us, you spend the most time looking at disinformation because you track it. That's one of the things you do.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts about what to do? Is it a public policy issue? Is it for NGOs? Is it for journalists?
So I think two things, one of which ties both of these thoughts together. The first is that this is clearly a collective problem that clearly we're making a lot of progress on the stage on, and we're going to solve it in the next 30 minutes. But this is a collective problem, and so it's going to involve government, it's going to involve the tech company, it's going to involve media specifically. Those are the three groups that are largely involved, and NGOs, plug. But any one of those entities needs to create solutions using their own power or whatever levers they have in order to focus on how people actually consume information, right? And so for government, probably step one is having policymakers that understand what the internet is and what these social media platforms are. So in order to create, but that's a serious note, it sounds like a joke, but in order to not create policies that have second, third, fourth order effects that they frankly don't understand. And if you need an example of that, please go watch testimony with the social media companies, where they're like, the internet exists, please explain. That's probably not a good basis for policy.
But it's also the case that there are ways you could regulate the internet that would have evil effects down the road, including, as I said, I agree with Edward completely, that focusing on content and restricting content is going to get us into questions of free speech and censorship almost immediately, whereas looking at how the platforms are structured and how the internet is structured would work better.
And that goes to the second group, which is the social media companies, right? There are things that they can do to design their platforms in a different way that deal with this.
But unfortunately, they don't have a financial incentive to do that.
Right. And frankly, I don't want Facebook, and I don't want Google, and I don't want Twitter, and I don't want any other social media platform making decisions about speech. And without
which actually they do
policies,
already,
right? And so I don't want them to be solely responsible for this. And then for media, right? Media is the main vector by which people consume information at this point. And so here's the problem that we're trying to solve for. In 2016, there were leaks, as were mentioned, and then they were coordinated on Reddit, and then they spread to Twitter, and then they spread to Facebook, and then they spread to fringe media, and then they were on the front page of the New York Times for about 4 weeks. And that's the entire ecosystem that we're trying to solve for. And that's really, really tough. And that goes back to the points that were both made here, which is at bottom, for disinformation, there is no cost, right? There is no cost that is incurred by those who are exposed to spreading disinformation. And that goes from the consumer level, the citizen level, up to the nation state level. And by that I mean, if you and I are having a conversation here, and we're talking in person, and I say something blatantly false or outright egregious, then there's a cost because you'll call me out on that, right? You'll be like, "Are you kidding me, Graham? That's absolutely ridiculous. I will have to pay a social cost for that." That doesn't exist on the internet right now. And then if you scale that up to nation states, right? If Russia is interfering in U.S. elections, there is no cost for them to spread that content. And in a traditional national security
We're trying,
sense,
kind of.
right? We would call it, as national security experts, we would call that deterrence, but deterrence doesn't quite work for this, right? And so,
Well, we're sanctioning them.
right?
Economic sanctions.
And one of the things that we get asked quite often is, how do we go on offense on this? And this is a problem of information pollution, and you're not going to solve it by polluting the information environment more. You can't fight disinforming content with disinforming content, or with other content, frankly. And so you have to figure out a way to not get into a sustained back and forth that accepts the premise of disinformation to begin with and rise above it. And so that's one of the things that clearly I didn't just produce any things going forward. Right? I navel-gazed at a bunch of problems, but this is to unpack all of these core components in order to take them on individually.
Sorry, go on.
Very briefly, I think that actually social norms are evolving very quickly on the internet, given how long it's been around. When was the last time anyone here sent a letter, an email in capital letters? Now, we used to do that a lot. That's now considered really rude. Don't say it. When was the last time anyone sent a long email? Again, people used to send really long emails and then get cross when people didn't read them. Now emails are getting shorter. So I think we are evolving quite quickly on the normative side, which is good. And I think that we will see more and more normative pressure against these sort of transgressive acts on the internet. So people may think it's actually really bad for my career to work at RT or Sputnik. Yeah, I used to say that would be like working for an arms company, but I said this at a defense conference and the room went rather quiet. And I looked behind me, it said sponsored by Lockheed Martin. So I don't say that anymore. I'm much more worried that I think we may have actually been in a really easy era with platforms that are at least sort of in the public space, trying to do the right thing, have shareholders, will come and talk to Congress. And I think what really worries me is that we're moving away from this kind of semi-transparent world of platforms towards encrypted peer-to-peer messaging, where the people who run it, there may be really no one who runs it. You have encrypted peer-to-peer messaging systems that aren't really owned by anybody. You just download them, install them on your phone and start messaging. And so we've got no visibility on the content. And the other thing that really worries me is that we're only scratching the surface so far of the ability to generate fake content, really fake content in the form of fake video and audio. And how do we, and that will not only be great for disinformation, it's going to make people much less trusting about what they see on the mainstream.
I was going to say, I think fundamentally what we have, and this is why I think this is so damaging to democracy, is what we have is an increasing problem of trust.
Yeah.
One of the effects of polarization is that it makes people distrust mainstream institutions. They think that whatever it is, the courts or the press have been somehow captured by the other side, and so it erodes trust for those institutions that hold the center together. And the internet has somehow increased that, and I'm afraid that it's going even further in that direction.
And if I could just make a quick comment on that, because this is not my original idea, so I stole it from one of these papers. But the point, and actually I think it might have been a paper by Senator Mark Warner, where he said that there is a way to regulate this the way that we regulate any publicly traded company, right? There's the SEC, which says you have to have transparency. So for example, Ed's example, where with the blue checks, you can't have any fakes, because you're inflating then the value of your company illegally. And then there's fair trade that the FTC oversees. So there are ways to regulate.
A friend of mine who works in capital markets in London said to me, we managed to regulate international financial markets where there are billions of dollars at stake. Everybody's trying to cheat. It's really worth it's really worth it to cheat, and yet we managed to do it. Why can't we regulate social media too? Okay, so I have a couple of questions here from the audience, some of which are interesting. One, all of them are interesting. All of them.
No.
All of them. You think some of what I'm saying is interesting too. Thank you.
Some of us.
Okay, so here's an interesting one for the Russia experts on this panel. How are disinformation crafters able to find and probe polarizing issues with such precision? In particular, how do they manage to do it across borders and cultures? So I have some thoughts about that, but I'll let Edward, Evelyn, where is it coming from?
I'll try and give a mildly interesting answer. I think it's interesting that Russia is much better at this than China, and we should ask why. When I used to work at The Economist, one of my jobs was dealing with the sort of how we think about comments. And it was interesting, the Chinese 50-cent bloggers would post comments saying things like, after this stupid anonymous, I've subscribed to The Economist for 20 years, and after you've published this stupid anonymous article attacking China, I'm cancelling my subscription. And as all articles in The Economist, it was so obvious that was not very successful. They hadn't got much value for their 50 cents, whereas the Russian ones tend to be much more sophisticated. And I think we need to, this is partly, I think, a question for our intelligence community. We need to get much better at going upstream into the Russian decision-making and work out how they're doing their targeting. If you have artillery shells landing precisely on the places you don't want them to land, you start asking how the other side's artillery is doing so well. You start wondering maybe they have some spotters on the ground. And
yeah, my thesis is they just learned it from us. I mean, they watched you can figure out what the polarizing narratives are on the internet by looking at the internet.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
What do you think?
So, well, first of all, they were good at it when they were Soviets during the Cold War. They knew what all of our cleavages, and they just went
they weren't that
to
good
exacerbate them. Yeah. Well, they couldn't reach in directly to the American people back then the way they can now remotely, right? Reaching millions of people in theory. So there's that. And I will say, I mean, I was in the Pentagon in 2015, and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations happened. And those were, at the core of them were real issues, real problems that we have in America, right? And yet, I looked at it and I said, I bet you $1 million the Russians are in there taking advantage somehow. And sure enough, it turns out they will. So anywhere where there's a cleavage, they're going to take advantage. They just understand our society. You turn on RT, it's all about how African Americans are suffering and how the inner city is, falling apart. I mean, actually, frankly, it's a lot of what our president says when he gets to a podium, painting this really bleak picture of America, right? American carnage. The inner cities are falling apart, infrastructure is falling apart. Of course, there's always some truth there, right? But it's their take on it, which is exaggerated.
Can I just add to how that happens? Because everybody in this room could do this right now. It's basic audience engagement. If you were to pull out your phone and open up Twitter and look at the trending topics and then pick whichever one you wanted and then say something crazy about that thing that tries to shift people either in one direction or the other, and then do that at scale with an entire team of your friends, then you could probably shift that conversation, right? And that's what they do.
Yeah. No, I mean, the other thing really important to remember about disinformation, and this is another reason why the Russians chose to focus on it, is that it's actually, relatively speaking, extremely cheap. Mm-hmm. It doesn't cost very much. It's not even particularly high tech. Setting up a bot farm, anybody can do that. And by compared to, building tanks or aircrafts, aircraft carriers, it's nothing. And so one of the reasons why the Russians invested in it was because it was a way to, to try and mold the enemy without actually having to confront it from their perspective, the enemy.
And we won't strike back at them for an information attack because we haven't defined what that is.
No.
So there was, can I just give an example of this? There was a criminal case that was published by the Eastern District of Virginia, which if none of you have read it, I wouldn't blame you. But it had some interesting stuff in it. And one thing was editorial meetings that were happening at the IRA, right? And so this came out
as part of the Mueller investigation.
Actually, as part of a separate criminal investigation. But basically, there were conversations between basically the editors at the St. Petersburg Troll Factory. And after 2016, in the first half of 2018, they were posting a bunch of stuff. I would call them equal opportunity hyper-partisans. And they were posting a bunch of stuff that was anti-Russia. So if you can imagine the laughs that they were getting sitting in Russia, it was like, okay, well, we're going to post some crazy stuff. And typically we would get in trouble with all of our bosses for saying anti-Russia stuff. But the decision that they made was that it would make their adversary weaker to deal with Russia itself, right? So even if they were saying, okay, well, this administration is a bunch of Russian stooges and Russia is the main national security threat to the United States and all this stuff, they made a decision that even if they said that, they would make us less capable of dealing with Russia as a threat. And that's a very interesting editorial decision.
Yeah, in Poland, some of the Russian disinformation also, they promote narratives and groups and people as well who are anti-Russian, because everybody in Poland's anti-Russian, but who are also anti-German, anti-European, anti-Ukrainian. So in other words, they promote a kind of far-right narrative, which is useful to them in other ways, and they don't care that it's anti-Russian. So they're not looking for friends. Here's another question. Sorry. Disinformation is nothing new, we just have newer and faster means for distribution, says the questioner. Shouldn't some solutions consider an understanding of people's susceptibility to this kind of rhetoric? Yeah. In other words, isn't part of the problem the audience? And this is also a question, of course, about media literacy, and maybe also a question for the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. You know, should it be studying why some people are susceptible and not others? Well, do you have a view?
Sorry. Yep. Well, yes, because I think it ties into the erosion of community. I'm not going to speak for other countries because, you know, I'm American, so I speak foremost for my country. But we have had a demonstrated lack of erosion in community. The last Obama administration Surgeon General said that there's a loneliness epidemic because of this lack of community. And I think people find community, but in this kind of rage, extreme way. You know, you find community not based on positive things on the internet, but often based on your anger about something. So I think that might be the seeking of community, and you can easily attract these people who are feeling lonely and bitter and disenfranchised. Somehow.
There's a very good Swedish study, a huge book, in fact, on what they call psychocognitive hacking. But my worry here is that we're assuming that all this works. And the thing that I'm always worried about with talk about disinformation is that we think because it's visible, it matters. And I really looked hard at the viewership for RT in Britain. Because everyone talks about RT, the former Russia Today. But actually, we have 3 shopping channels in Britain called QVC. You probably have them over here. RT scores worse than QVC3. That's really quite bad. And it's something like 30,000 Brits watch RT for an hour once a month. It's almost unmeasurable. So I worry that I think that when it's hostile states are concerned, information is just part of the toolkit. They use dirty money, they use subversion, intimidation, lawfare, all sorts of different, 20 or more different tactics. And I worry that we look too much at the information bit because we see it, and maybe don't look enough about, is large amounts of Russian money going into political action committees, for example, or other countries' money and so on. So I'd be interested to know from Graham, you're very good at sort of seeing the disinformation as it comes in. How do we measure its reach and impact in a way that makes sense?
It depends on the platform. There's a lot of very specific technical answers to that, right? But one of the things that we need to do is, you're both right in the sense that any solution, the questioner is right as well, any solution needs to be based in how humans actually consume information. And so if, for instance, as a real example, if we're monitoring disinformation ahead of the naming referendum in Macedonia. There was an election in Macedonia recently. It's a country of 2 million people, the vast majority of which, to the tune of about 80%, get their news from broadcast television. And then online news portals exist. There's not a huge consolidated media market. There's not a New York Times that everybody reads, right? But everybody online, there's 92% of people online that consume Facebook. And then Twitter has a market share of about 0.0001%. And there was a lot of research that was done in the Macedonia naming referendum that said half of the conversation online is Russian and it's automated. And it's because they were looking at like 5 out of 10 of the Twitter accounts that are active in Macedonia, right? And so you're not gonna have a huge amount of good information to make policy based off of if you're getting a bunch of false positives. So you have to do basic market research on where people are actually engaging with each other specifically, rather than where we think we're engaging with people. And that's going to be true in any basic media market, but especially for the social media platforms.
Here's another similar question. What responsibility does the public have to change their behavior? How do we educate the public to be savvy consumers of information online? Can we? This is actually something that interests me because I do think you can.
You should answer that one.
No,
go ahead. We defer to you.
Yep.
No, I think so. If you've had, in an earlier conversation today, we were talking about anti-smoking campaigns. You could have campaigns that teach people to better, particularly if you begin to have some better signaling on the internet, identification of where websites are from, identification of where ads are from. You can teach people to be aware of things like that and pay attention to them. I don't think you can, I don't want to overestimate what's possible, but I do think, I even see, for example, in my children, I see they're a generation which is much more accustomed to reading everything online, and they are much more skeptical than I think people who are 30 and 40 years older are, just
also,
because they're used to it.
I think the best example, I think, is road transport. Because it's a very complicated system, lots of actors, lots of responsibility on the individual, big thing for government, big industry. And there's no single way of fixing death on the roads. We have collapsed the number of road casualties. In Britain, it's gone down from 6,500 when I was a kid to about 1,000 now. So that's fallen by 5/6 in 30-something years. And we did it with all sorts of different things. We changed the design of cars. We re-engineered the physical road system, rethought junctions, better signposting. We had strong criminal prosecutions for certain things that were like drinking and driving. And we had lots and lots of public messaging about how to behave. And the result was that you sort of squeeze the problem from every direction. I think it's a bit like that on the internet, that you go to the people who are making money and say you're making money in a law-governed space, but you need to change the way you're making money because this is really hurting society. And yes, and you have ostracism for people who do bad things. Some of them you have to put them in prison. And yes, absolutely, there's public messaging about what is responsible behavior. Short of illegality, and there's a lot of stuff you don't do on the road, not because it's illegal not to do it, but just because you don't want to be a bad driver.
I like that.
It's in my book.
Here's another question. Edward, who would you task with administrating a worldwide identity confirmation system? Surely not individual nation states, as that would be rife for abuse.
I don't think you're going to have I think that the cryptographic infrastructure is absolutely vital. We need a way of signing stuff digitally to show who we are, the physical, the electronic counterpart of, and there's got to be a way of recognizing that. And I think the way you do that is you have lots of different providers of identity. And the key thing is making sure that they are able to talk to each other. So I actually have an Estonian digital ID because my own country doesn't do them, but Estonia does them for expats. So I can use that. And are there any Estonians here in the room? Yeah, okay. So I can send you an email that you know came from me, and I can send you a document that only you can read. And you can do the same to me. We are able to communicate on a kind of different level to everybody else here. I don't even
On a
know
very Estonian level.
What?
On an Estonian
Does it have to be in
level.
Estonian?
Can you be in English or indeed in Estonian? And you're only resident. Okay, so you understand. So this now, lots of Singapore is thinking of doing this. There are private sector providers who are thinking of doing this, and I think that's fine. I would not want to have some kind of global ID czar issuing and taking away identities. But once you've got them, it's quite easy to make them mutually recognizable, and then you've got the basis for the sort of trust that we have when we meet each other in the offline world.
Right. There's one more question here, which I don't know the answer to, but maybe one of you does, which is to what degree during the last election was it not just disinformation, but also actual voting machines being hacked? Any views on that?
So elections are critical infrastructure.
Right.
Full stop. Elections are critical infrastructure. I think that in terms of electronic voting systems, there are a number of vulnerabilities that have been well researched and well discussed in public. The Belfer Center at Harvard has done a large project on this, and there are a number of companies that are doing large projects on this. The main concern with electronic voting systems is their coding, yes, but also their supply chain, right? And so if some of those parts were made in China or elsewhere, then that should be of concern. The only way today to prevent that from being a potential threat to actual voting infrastructure is to have backups or redundancies in that system. The safest redundancy today is having backup paper ballots. And outside of that, it gets a lot harder. It's not impossible, and I'm sure there are technical means in order to do that, but start to finish, every core component of a voting machine, every piece of software that goes into that system, there are vulnerabilities and there are not that many redundancies. And so in order to solve for that, you need to think about those two things. But the fail-safe way of dealing with that today, backup paper ballots.
And the analogy I just made up in my head, is the backup paper ballot is sort of like making sure that pilots can still fly on instrumentation.
I don't.
Not topical at all.
Today, right?
I don't agree, but anyway.
Right, and maybe to kind of to conclude the panel, one of the things that always bothers me about this conversation is that the kind of disinformation and the nature of it keeps changing. And everybody who I talk to, although I've said now several times that I think regulation is possible, one of the concerns is that as the field develops and changes, it will have to change too. What do you all see coming next? And are there ways we can now anticipate so that there isn't another 2016 when we're all caught out, so that by 2020 we're better prepared, we know what kinds of disinformation campaigns are coming and what it's going to look like? How would you throw it forward?
I mean, most people talk about these fake videos and fake audio, and I don't know what the answer is.
I'm a little skeptical about this, the future of disinformation, because there is a technical conversation to be had, yes. Deep fakes will exist in the near or far future, that's absolutely true. But if you are somebody who is spreading disinformation and you have limited resources and limited time and you have a big mission, you want to go out and lie to as many people as possible, you want to achieve impact, the biggest tool that you have at your disposal is not necessarily like some deepfake technology or some piece of artificial intelligence that's going to do it for you. It's basic creativity, right? It's basic creativity that goes into audience engagement. And so today, what I can say is, our team hasn't seen a deepfake that has been effective at scale, or it didn't cost a lot of money and a lot of time that went into it. But what we do see is a lot of images with some text that achieve a lot of like memes, spicy memes for the young people in the room. And those achieve a lot of audience impact, and they're very shareable, and they're very creative. And that is the future of disinformation. What is the lowest cost means in order to reach as many people as possible? And so what can we actually do about that? I mean, a lot of people talk about media literacy, teaching people how better to consume media, digital literacy, teaching people better how to navigate the online information environment. I would add cyber hygiene, which is a term that the speechwriters used to hate, but teaching people how to protect their data footprint, whether it's posting things in public on Facebook or online banking, right? Teaching people that they have a footprint that exists that creates vulnerabilities. But the biggest thing is basic democracy, right? Teaching people how to better participate in their own society. And that's going to be, I mean, democracy's main strength is that it's self-corrective. And right now it feels like it's not self-corrective. And in order for it to achieve that, it all depends on all of us participating in a clear and coherent way that is logical and fact-based and makes good decisions. And so we need to solve for that. That's the core component.
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think that the thing I think you should look out for in the short term is going to be people getting very worked up about the politics of algorithms and algorithmic transparency, because the way these algorithms make decisions, I mean, including the question of self-driving cars, which apparently have been trained, the algorithms are all trained on white people, so they don't recognize black people. This stuff was in the news yesterday. I don't know if that's true or not, but this is the sort of instinctive, unthought of biases of the people who design things ripple out with dramatic consequences into real life. And I think you're going to see probably more discussion on that. And that would include, for example, the way in which the algorithms on platforms try to encourage more engagement by provoking and stirring people. So I think it's that will, when people are being hit, I mean, either hurt physically or hit in their pockets, that's when they start getting engaged more than when they're losing their freedoms and losing their political rights.
Right, so there we have it. We're going to regulate the social media companies. We're going to hit back at the Russians.
Smarter policymakers.
We're going to have smarter people in Congress.
Spicy memes.
We're going to make our own spicy memes.
Yeah. Classic.
And a global digital cryptographic infrastructure.
And a global digital cryptographic, and the idea actually that I had last night, which is that we rethink the transatlantic alliance around these issues, and put these at the heart of what it means to be Western. You know, how do we have a democratic internet that works for us and reflects our values? And if we could begin thinking about that as soon as possible.
See you next year.
See you next year, right. Thank you.
Is this working? Here we go. Our next panel will start at 3:40. Thank you. Before I introduce the next panel, I want to make sure that you all remember at the end of the program, again, there are books outside that are many of our panelists from today have written if you want to continue your education. Also, in light of the last panel on disinformation, please make sure to log onto your Twitter and use our hashtag Reawaken Democracy if you want to spread information about today. This is not about disinformation. Anyway, so let's welcome to the stage our final panel. And once again, thanks to all of you for being here today. I hope that you found this as informative and engaging as we have. Bret Stephens, New York Times columnist, will be our moderator for this final panel, Toward a Common American Strategy. He will be joined by Maryland's former senator and Hopkins' own Senator Barbara Mikulski, former House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, Ambassador Paul Wolfowitz, and Senator Ben Cardin will be here shortly. He is stuck in Washington traffic, which is why I encourage all of you who live in D.C. to move to Baltimore, because then you won't have to deal with that. So with that, I will turn it over to Bret and say thanks to all of you.
Well, Elizabeth, can all of you hear me? Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for coming to what I hope was a day that you profited from intellectually and that you'll remember going forward. We hope to be able to do it again. I'm joined by an extraordinarily distinguished panel. Elizabeth has already furnished the introductions. I just want to extend my thanks for all of you for coming here and to Senator Cardin once he arrives. Particularly thanks to Paul, who took the red eye in from California just to be able to join us. So it was very gracious.
So if I fall asleep, I have an excuse.
Yes, exactly. If he slurs his words, So, Eric, let me start with you. So you walk into a bar in Richmond, Virginia, and you're sitting there nursing your scotch, and someone sidles up to you and starts haranguing you. And at some point he says, tell me, explain to me this. What is wrong with America First? What is wrong with asking our allies to pony up more for their own defense? What is wrong for letting them do more work? And what's wrong with using our advantages of size and scale and power to extract better trade deals? Tell me why the phrase America First ought to be problematic for any American who cares about the interests of this country or their families.
Well, anyway, Bret, thanks. It's great to be here. What a beautiful building. First time here, too. Let me start by sort of asking the question of what we mean when we say America First. Because to me, if we mean America's ideals, if we mean our founding principles, I am for that. I am for that. The question really becomes, is that what others mean when they say America First, as your question implies? I just feel that, when you look at the declarative, if you will, principles of our country, found in the Declaration of Independence, the protection of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And then you look to see what our Constitution did with those principles, now insisting that we have representative government, that we have a check on power, and we have an insistence in the protection of the rights of people who happen to be in the minority. That, to me, is what America First means. And so if we're going to be for those principles, then I am all for America First. And we've certainly seen that nowhere else in the world can we see a demonstrative example of where your fruits of your labor belong to you, where we have demonstrated that free markets are the best means to prosperity. And I believe, Bret, that that notion of America allows us to be a force for good in the world. Now, the suggestion that we should just merely engage in bilateral discussions with allies and others because we'll have an advantage, we'll win. Yes, we've got the biggest economy in the world, we've got the strongest military in the world, but what happens when we don't? And what happens to our allies when they get sick of the bullying that comes from that kind of mentality? And then we become not just America first, and I think you've written about this, Brett, and America feared. And then along comes another bully that's bigger than we are. So I think it is about America, the idea of America first, not this very transactional, we're bigger than you, so we're going to win.
Senator Mikulski, do you want to tell us what troubles you about America first?
Well, first of all, if I walked into a bar in Baltimore, I wouldn't be drinking scotch. And I am going to answer your question, but I really would just like to compliment President Daniels and Elizabeth and the Agora team that put on this spectacular evening last night and today, and to have a place and a space where we could have this. It's been a very content-rich time. First of all, America first. Does that mean American only? I would share some of Eric's sentiments here. As we know, the slogan, America First, was first coined in, or at least in my historical knowledge, in the 1930s, and it was really meant to be a mean term. It was xenophobic, it was nativistic, it was not exactly the ideals that we wanted to talk about. And if we want to talk about America only, then we're in trouble, because America can only be a robust power in the world if we're connected to allies. The second thing is that America needs to be known as even-handed and not heavy-handed. Even-handed leadership, we were once thought of as the indispensable nation. We're no longer thought about that. We're now thought about an unreliable ally by pulling out of treaties. And America, as it talks to reform of international organizations, we've been very good about that. Eric and I would probably agree on the need for the UN to reform itself. It's a bloated bureaucracy, but it's an important role in the world. Strengthen the important role, but deal with the bloated bureaucracy. Also, we Democrats that are center-left have to not be afraid to look at international institutions for reform. I believe one of the reasons I liked authorizing legislation that had a limit on it was that you needed to always review, reflect, and reform. Maybe we do need to look at NATO and who pays for fair share, but we cannot jeopardize the future of NATO. So America first, I think it's to lead with their ideals, to back it up with power, not only hard power, but soft power, and always to have value-based leadership, and the values I'm talking about are embedded in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution.
Paul, do you want to?
Well, I guess it's worth reminding people, I'm looking around this audience, first I want to say it's great to be back at Hopkins. I used to commute the wrong way from Washington on a regular basis when I was dean at SAIS and would come up here for Dean's Council meetings and Board of Trustees meetings. And I sort of envied the people who could just stay up here and not go through the Washington traffic. So my sympathy to Senator Cardin. But there was an allusion to it, but it's worth emphasizing. That phrase, America First, has a really ugly history. In the 1930s, it was shorthand for to put it crudely, there's nothing wrong with that guy Hitler. It's just a bunch of Jews that want to get us involved in another war in Europe. And we should not get into entangling alliances. Now, I use that phrase, entangling alliances, with malice aforethought, because going back much earlier when it wasn't America First, but it was George Washington saying quite eloquently in his farewell address, I believe, that the U.S. should not get involved in the conflicts of Europe. America should come first. We're just barely an independent country. We're not an equal of the great powers in Europe. We should be careful about how we squander American resources and American influence, as limited as it was. But he was talking as the leader of a weak country, a country that was separated by oceans that weren't spanned by intercontinental jet aircraft. It's a completely different world today now, and the United States is not separate from that world. We have an enormous stake in the peace and stability of the rest of the world, and I would say the freedom of the rest of the world, very importantly. He was arguing we don't have an interest in the French Revolution. I think he was right about that in terms of where our interests lay. But I do think that today we have a huge interest in promoting freedom in countries that are struggling to be free or struggling to stay free in some cases. And I do think it's not an accident, comrade, as the Russians used to say, that our three greatest adversaries in the world, Russia, China, and Iran, are unfree countries that are desperately threatened by the notion of freedom, which I think is not about America first, it's about freedom first.
One of the accusations made against the current administration is that it conducts a foreign policy on a highly transactional, what's in it for me or what's in it for us basis. But in a sense, transactional foreign policy is to some extent a reaction to foreign policies that some may claim were excessively predicated on commitment to values that cost us dearly and that sometimes took us beyond where prudence or our interests really lay. So I want to get at this question. I know it's a broad one, but maybe Paul, you'll start. We'll go in the opposite direction. So what are the values in foreign policy that are non-negotiable, and what are the interests that are really worth fighting for?
I think it's worth fighting for the safety and security of the United States and American freedom. But I think one has to be very careful about what's worth fighting for. Excuse me. I want to use the Somalia example from 1992 as an illustration. We got involved in Somalia during the end of the first Bush administration when I was in the Pentagon. It's basically a humanitarian action. There were 200,000 people on the verge of starving to death in that country. And by intervening militarily, we were able to end that famine and save literally hundreds of thousands of lives. I had the feeling at the time that to fail to do that would be comparable to this infamous incident in New York where there's some debate about the facts, but at any rate, the illustration to me is for people to sit by and not even call the police when that's all it would take to end a mugging, a horrible tragedy.
Kitty Genovese.
Kitty Genovese, exactly. And I thought we were in that same position in Somalia, that we could save a couple 100,000 lives with basically virtually no risk to American men and women in uniform, which I do think is something that any American leader has to really put at the top of the list. And I don't think, I would agree with people who say they're not volunteering to make some well-meaning people, including myself back in the United States, who want to do good in the world at the expense of American lives. I think that's not acceptable. And unfortunately, that mission got transformed. After the famine ended, we decided, or the Clinton administration decided, there was a lot of confusion because of this policy starting with one administration, continuing with another one. And the feeling was, well, if we don't do something to install a democratic government in Somalia, things will just go back to where they were. Well, the attempt to install democracy in Somalia, I would say, is like planting corn in the desert. It had little to no chance of succeeding. And it ended up with, I guess it was 27 Americans killed in Black Hawk Down. We not only didn't accomplish the mission, we ran away with our tail between our legs. And it was, I think, bad for American prestige and credibility. I think it's a very different thing to use military force where the security of the United States is at stake than to use it, and it can be appropriately used and very impressively used in humanitarian missions. I'll give you one other example, which is in 2004 there was this massive tsunami in Southeast Asia. I think 100,000 Indonesians died in Western Indonesia from the tidal wave, which is terrible. I visited right after, flew over in a U.S. helicopter. It looked like pictures of Hiroshima. By going in there with the U.S. military, we probably saved another 100,000 people who might have starved to death or died of thirst. that was an absolutely impressive use of American military power for a purely humanitarian mission. Well, I say purely, but not entirely purely, because it turned Indonesian opinion in that is to say, in the largest Muslim population country in the world, from being negative about the United States to being extremely positive. And that's good for American interests as well. But we did it for purely humanitarian reasons. That I would support. But I think I may not like the way this president goes at it, but I do think there's a burden sharing issue that Americans shouldn't be sacrificing more for other people's interests than they're willing to do for themselves. But I would argue that very, very often we manage to get, to use the crude words of General Patton, to get other people to die for their country instead of getting Americans to die for ours. It's a burden sharing that Ronald Reagan practiced, I think, with a very skillful way in what was called the Reagan Doctrine.
Eric, the balance of interests and values?
So, you know, what comes to mind is back in the summer of 2013, and this was the so-called Red Line incident in Syria. And I think it was a huge missed opportunity on the part of President Obama's administration to not take advantage of the opportunity to set the record straight as to what it meant when the President of the United States gave his word, and then to live up to that. And in a way, to me, that's values-based foreign policy and reaction to a given situation that was just missed, and I think had real consequences in the region, had real consequences in terms of signaling to our allies, had real consequences in terms of signaling, Senator, real consequences in terms of signaling to our adversaries there. So I do believe strongly that America's word must be golden. Senator Mikulski spoke about some of the word that may have been broken in terms of entering into treaties otherwise. I think there's issues we probably agree on there, and some maybe we disagree, but I think of the utmost importance is that consistency to the adherence of those core values I talked to before. And when we believe it's wrong for a despot dictator to use chemical or biological weapons on their citizenry, that is a value and that we ought to stand up for. And then again, on the interest side, as Paul said, you've got to protect Americans from physical harm. That's an interest, but yet I think America is bigger than that. And I believe, as Senator Mikulski referred to, that we are an indispensable force. And although we may suffer some in our reputation internationally right now because of various things that have transpired, not just in this administration, but in those prior, we've got work to do, but I believe we must stand up to that.
Senator Cardin, welcome to the panel. We're so glad you made it. We're worried about the Washington traffic.
I am so glad I don't have to do this anymore.
We don't have Senator Mikulski on the Appropriations Committee to protect us on our transportation funds, so it's taken an extra half an hour since she's left the Senate.
But we do have Senator Cardin on the Foreign Relations Committee, so that's an added bonus for us. I just want to press you, Eric, one more point. We were just, Senator Cardin, just to bring you up to speed, we're talking about the balance of interests and values in American foreign policy and trying to figure out, you know, what the proper balance ought to be. You referred to the 2013 ultimatum that President Obama delivered on the use of chemical weapons as a red line for the United States. Of course, then that August chemical weapons were used. President went to the Congress at the time and faced overwhelming rejection, not so much from Democrats, but actually from your own caucus, from the Republicans. And I want to just briefly, do you think that was a turning point for the Republican Party, which had traditionally been associated with a sort of a more muscular interventionist style of politics, towards the kind of quasi-isolationism you see today?
So I actually may differ a little bit from that view, because just being in the middle of it at that time, because I recall having heard, once the news reports were out about what Assad had done against his population, I picked up the phone and called the White House. It was at the time I was leader, and told then at the time the Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, that I, as well as Speaker John Boehner, would stand with the president if he decided to use military force. And even went and put out a statement to that effect, that we would stand with him. And it was 4 days later that we heard in the news, never got a call, that the White House decided it was going to go to Congress to seek authority for the use of that military force. At that point, things were so toxic from a partisan standpoint. I'm not so sure that the decision of my caucus at the time was to just stand up and say no intervention. It had gotten so personal towards mistrust in the White House, in the president, that they were just, that was the priority. And remember again, you know, President Obama was the president that was elected to pull us out of situations like Iraq and Afghanistan. So his caucus was in no way ready to go and step up to offer that kind of support for his decision to go in and use force either.
Let me pick up on that with Senator Cardin. Has Washington become so toxically partisan now that it's incapable of formulating even a common foreign policy on foundational issues?
I don't believe in foreign policy. I think we do work pretty closely together, Democrats and Republicans. Look at the CATSA bill that was passed early in the Trump administration, where we had overwhelming bipartisan support to counter the president's initiative with Russia after its attack on our country during the elections. We have seen on the Saudi policy, I think you're going to see more and more consensus in Congress that disagrees with the administration on foreign policy. We saw that on the vote yesterday in the floor of the Senate, where the majority of the Senate, controlled by Republicans, voted to disagree with the president on his policy in regards to Yemen. So I think we had hearings this week on China. We've had hearings on Syria. There's been more agreement. Now, if you get into a partisan division because the president is using his bully pulpit to intimidate Republicans, yes, we'll have problems getting the type of votes that we need. I might tell you the reason I was late is that the delay on the vote to counter the president's use of executive emergency declaration for the wall, that vote was overwhelmingly against the president. 59 senators voted.
So what you're saying is we have a bipartisan foreign policy in Congress, just not one with the executive.
That's accurate. The president's sort of in a sphere by himself. I mean, he's isolated America on foreign policy, and I think he does not have the support in Congress for a large part of his foreign policy agenda.
Senator Mikulski, Senator Cardin alluded to this with the discussion of Saudi Arabia and Yemen. And this is a broad question, but what should U.S. policy be when it comes to non-democratic, frequently authoritarian, human rights abusing regimes such as Saudi Arabia that happen to be allies of the United States? What should be our posture towards these sorts of countries? Egypt is another example.
There's a difference between engagement and approval. And I believe, first of all, in diplomacy is our first strategy to engage in the world. And to engage with anti-democratic regimes, we have to have conversations and dialogue to protect our own people, to protect our own interests, etc. But we don't have to approve of them, and we don't have to try to imitate them, and we don't have to try to encourage them. And we don't have to turn a blind eye, like in, of course, the murder of the journalist and the murder of the journalist. So I think that's
Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes, and the point that I'm making, though, is you see that's where, when we talk about democratic values, lots of times I used to hear, well, what values are you talking about? But one, the promotion of constitution, because I heard that all the time, well, you've got to put the values on. But to encourage constitutional government, to talk about the Bill of Rights. I had the great honor and privilege as a senator, because I was the senior woman in the Senate, women from around the world would come and talk to me. And one of the things they couldn't get over was that I'd started life in politics as a protester. And I said that I was always protected by the Constitution of the United States, the right to assembly, the right to freedom of speech, etc. And the fact is that in this country, instead of sending me to jail, they sent me to the Baltimore City Council and to the Congress. The importance of a constitutional government, the Bill of Rights, people wanted to hear about it. They wanted to take it when we met with dissidents around the world. This is why I was so proud of the Congress, while not only doing more of their Article I responsibility to the Constitution, but at the Munich Security Conference. At the Munich Security Conference just a few weeks ago, the United States Senate was there. And they were there in large numbers, and they engaged. They went to every meeting, they went to every committee, they talked with others. And from what I heard from people other than senators, was people loved it. The United States was back. They actually talked with people. They engaged in civil conversation. They wanted to know what was going on and how could there be cooperation. So I think, one, we have to continue to assert constitutional government. We have to stand up for values in our Bill of Rights. We have to stand up for human rights and the human rights of women and fragile populations. And that's what, that doesn't cost, you know, so. And of course, we have to protect our own selves. The rule of self-defense, but we don't have to engage with we don't have to think of intervention as our first tool of response.
We should talk about China. I think it's, by common consent, the great geopolitical challenger that the United States likely faces in this century, and that has a human rights connection as well, and long has had it since the days of Tiananmen Square and before. Paul, maybe I'll start with you, but you know, we clearly are working towards reformulating American foreign policy when it comes to China, having seen it as, of course, for the first 27 years after the revolution as an enemy, and then as a strategic partner vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and now once again as at least an adversary, if not yet an enemy. How should we think about strategic competition over the long term with China? And is this a relationship that's bound to slide into, to deteriorate further, or is there any turning it around? Small question.
Let me start answering your question, but also then I'd like to turn to Korea because I think it has some lessons there too. I was in charge of East Asia policy in the State Department during Reagan's first term and accompanied him on his first visit to China in 1980, only visit to China actually in 1984. Never liked the place, always felt this is a very repressive regime, but there were two things going for them. Number one, they were effectively an ally of the United States in restraining the Soviet Union. And secondly, whatever you thought about China in 1984, it was vastly better than China in 1974. And ever since then, with the important exception Brett mentioned of Tiananmen, there was generally a progression forward, even in the sense of not having presidents for life, but actually having a regular rotation of leadership in the country. And under this new so-called president, actually his real title is General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, let's not forget that. I think his real ambition is to be the next emperor of China, and he's well on the way to doing that. Things seem to be going backward both in China's relations with the outside world, including us, where they're increasingly expansionist, make outrageous claims about the South China Sea, for example, and have something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which if you drew a map, looks like the new Chinese empire, but it includes most of the Arabian Peninsula, large chunks of India. It's not a world that most people want to live in. And I think they've sort of declared themselves our antagonists. I think needs a stronger word than just competitor. And I think we have to wake up to that fact and recognize it and not be so complacent about a China that's simply getting stronger in part by stealing our technology and getting the benefits of a free trade regime that the United States is mainly responsible for. But, sorry. I'd like to, though, take the example of Korea in the 1980s, I think is a not unhelpful way to think about how do you deal with regimes that are incredibly distasteful. This one wasn't as bad as I think China is. They didn't have concentration camps, or as bad as North Korea, which also has concentration camps. By the way, I don't use that word lightly. In case people here are unaware of it, when I refer to concentration camps in China, you should know that in northwestern China, which is mainly Muslim, merely being suspected of being religious can get you and your family put into a so-called re-education camp to get your brain straight about the non-existence of God and other important issues for the regime. And it's pretty awful. But with South Korea in the 1980s, we were able to use a close alliance with a very dictatorial regime, number one, to secure the freedom of the leading political dissident, a man named Kim Dae-jung. And number two, and I would say even more importantly, to use that influence to push that regime into holding free and fair elections in 1987. So that Korea is now today not only a spectacular model of economic success, but of political progress as well. I think we need to do what we can to turn China back to that path instead of allowing this deterioration or acquiescing in it.
Do any of you think that's realistic? Eric?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we need our allies in this competition squaring off against China. And there's no question that I don't believe we should be picking trade fights with Europe while we are also simultaneously picking trade fights with China.
And Canada and Mexico, too.
And Canada and Mexico, too. But Europe is actually, you know, it's different. I mean, it goes back to this sort of transactional example, Brett, that you pointed out earlier. Of course, Canada and Mexico are going to capitulate and do what we say. They're derivative. Their economies rely so heavily on what we're about here. And, you know, for God's sakes, Canada, I mean, we're so close to Canada in so many different ways. We shouldn't be, you know, engaging like that. However, I do think Europe is very important for us as we square off against China, as we square off in terms of trade, in terms of reforming the WTO. You know, and that's why I was so disappointed to see both parties turn away from TPP. You know, we need our allies in South and East Asia more than any time before to counter the influence of China, and yet now we're out of that. So you ask, is this redeemable? Are we actually going to bring things back to more normalcy? I'll just give two examples that would hint to maybe there is some hope here. And one is, we were having a discussion just prior to taking the stage about the instances of so many wealthy Chinese looking to get their money and their millions, if not more, out of that country and into the U.S. And that is testament to something, that they can't wait to come under our system and safeguard their assets and their property here. Secondly, you know, I had an opportunity to meet with when I was abroad in my current life, I spend a lot of the time abroad, and speaking to some Chinese investors and business people. And they actually applauded the tough line that the Trump administration and President Trump himself are taking against the government in Beijing. Because in a way, they too are subject to the same kind of things that we're complaining about intellectual property theft, about forced localization or tech transfer. And so these business people in the private sector in Greater China are worried as well. So again, that gives me some sense that this system of top-down authoritarianism and the complete use of national power on everything, including business, at some point can't be sustainable.
I wanted to,
Could I just
please.
Go ahead, Ben.
We've got to get China right. China is perhaps our greatest challenge long term. We have some shorter term challenges. I missed your first question about balance, so I'm going to jump in here because I think it's important on China. We don't balance our values on foreign policy on other issues. We may balance, we shouldn't. We may balance an agenda. What do we want to press a country on a particular day? But our foreign policy must be based on our values. That's America's strength. That's what makes America so unique. It's not just our military and economic strength, it's what we stand for as a nation. So China needs to deal with the United States. You know, our market is critically important to them. We have to use that relationship to change the way that China is developing. You're absolutely right. When China accessioned into the WTO, we thought that would be a chapter in not just their economic progress, but also in their political and social reforms. And we've seen them move in the wrong direction. So yes, I think President Trump's got to be tough with China. I think he's showing that. But China steals our intellectual property. China's oppression against religious minorities. China's failure to allow much of its people to have opportunity in their country. We have to base our relationship on China based upon progress they make on these fronts. And yes, our trade policy has been compromised, not because of what the president's doing today. He's standing up to China. That's good. But as Eric pointed out, he's doing it alone. We should have had TPP done. You're right. We should have organized Asia so we had a stronger presence. We're dealing with a non-market economy. In TPP, we were dealing with non-market economies. We got to stand up for trade policies.
Can I just intercede for 1 second? Because I think you're saying something newsworthy. Until 2016, both leaders of the Democratic Party came out against TPP. Would you imagine?
Both candidates, I'm not sure leaders.
Well, candidates.
Also Harry Reid.
Yeah.
And Harry Reid came out against TPP. Do you think there is now a consensus once again in favor of free trade inside the Democratic Party?
Okay, so I'm a survivor.
But we'll never vote you off the island.
I understand that. I'm going to make a confession. I voted for NAFTA. I represent the state of Maryland. I'm still in the Congress of the United States. So TPP to me was a very important strategic partnership for the United States. Ambassador Balkis came before us and just explained the geopolitical issues involving TPP. It was also a quality agreement. For the first time, we had good governance and we had anti-corruption in a trade agreement with enforcement. We had good labor and environmental provisions in it. Was it perfect? No. Could it should have been improved? Absolutely.
Would you run for president? Great.
But to walk away from TPP was ridiculous. So I'm not alone in the Democratic Party. I'm probably in the minority in the Democratic Party, but I'm not alone. And we have been able, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, to be able to pass trade bills. Admittedly, many times it had the majority of Republicans, but we had enough Democrats that we can make an absolute majority. That's what we need. But leadership starts with the president, and the president decided to pull out of TPP. I think he knows he made a mistake.
Could I just say one word about China? When I was in the Senate, I was on the Intelligence Committee, and every head of every NDI, whether it was under a Republican president or a Democratic president, talked about China stealing our intellectual property. And they viewed it as the biggest heist in global history. So why find a cure for cancer when you can break into our labs and break into the research that our private sector is doing? The stealing of our intellectual property is probably one of the most serious issues that is facing us. So this whole fake thing about the wall and we're going to keep them out, et cetera, we need a cyber shield protecting our intellectual property. We need cyber shields to protect our grid, for one thing. So, and we're losing in the cyber world, and we're also not investing in our own future. So while China is dashing ahead in what to do with artificial intelligence, we're like playing this game of let's go back to a nostalgia economy. Nobody would like Bethlehem Steel to open more than Ben and I and the people we represented. But that's nostalgia economics.
Ron, are your servers secure? So you think.
Well, and let me just finish this one point. Yeah. So while we're all talking about this, Donald Trump just cut in the budget proposal he's just made something very important to this institution. He cut NIH by 13%.
It's horrible.
If there ever is one bipartisan agreement, is where the Congress would come together always to support NIH. Whether it's Roy Blunt or Barb Mikulski, or we always supported it. Why would we want to do that? And why? So I believe that in our battle for China, we must be very muscular to protect our intellectual property. We must begin to develop a cyber shield. And we also need to look at ourselves and where are we heading with technology? How are we looking ahead to over the horizon for the new technologies that are coming? Some that could help save us with global warming, but some that are going to be enormously disruptive with the artificial intelligence.
Briefly, Senator Cardin, I'll get to you in a second. Just briefly, so in the news now is the question of whether Huawei should be able to install 5G networks worldwide. It's a particular issue in Germany. As a consumer of intelligence, what you don't need to tell us exactly what you're seeing, but when you read that intelligence, how much does it alarm you, and would you make the case that a company like Huawei represents a threat to the national security of the United States and other free countries?
From what I know, and I don't have all the information, it's my assessment that it does represent a risk to the United States' national security. That China has had a reputation for implanting technology into sensitive infrastructure to compromise the national security of sovereign states. So that the challenge we have is that we don't have other sources of some of this technology. We're trying to develop that as quickly as we can here in the United States, but we've been too dependent upon Chinese technology to complete our 5G network. So yes, I am deeply concerned about our national security as it relates to this technology. And until we get a clean bill of health, we should not be moving forward. And I don't think we can get a clean bill of health. We're extremely concerned about our closest allies, though, taking a different tact. And so we don't have unity. So we talked before about, I don't know if you went to America alone or not, but we can't work in isolation. We need to have the support of Europe in what we do in this regard, and we don't have the support of Europe right now.
Paul, you wanted to say something briefly?
Yeah, I just think the loss of TPP is the loss of one of the most useful instruments we could have had for resisting China and without firing a shot. And it's not gone away completely because all the other countries led by Japan are constructing their own version of TPP. And I think the United States should have on its agenda to try to get back to it.
I'm going to ask you one last question in a lightning round. I swear it's going to be challenging. And then we'll take some questions that I have here on the tablet from the audience. But the question that I want each of you to answer is say something nice about the Trump administration's foreign policy. One thing that you like.
I'll say it.
Let me go as a Democrat. I really do believe that the Trump administration has Venezuela right. And I think they have provided the type of leadership in the manner they provided that leadership, giving Europe some space to come along with us, isolating the Maduro regime, using the proper threats, but having the policies that make it very likely that we will use diplomacy and pressure in order to bring down the regime. I think that they have Venezuela right.
Look, and I would say this, as Paul sort of said it before, maybe some of the ways that the administration has gone about things is what sort of causes the initial reaction. But I'll just go back to this China issue. I think standing up to China is the right thing to do. And he's been tough on it. And it just hasn't been that way prior for whatever reason. Now, we'll see how things end up on this trade negotiation. Because if we cave in and then just accept some transactional solution, as in China can just buy some more of our stuff without structural changes with the ability to enforce those commitments, then I may take what I'm saying back. But I do think getting tough on China is exactly what we need to be doing.
Senator Mikulski.
I'm thinking. And by the way, you can't have lightning rounds with a senator and a former senator. It would be an oxymoron. I concur with Senator Cardin on Venezuela, though we do not look for interventionism.
No.
And that has to be very clear. The second thing is the fact that when he pays attention and appoints good people, good things do happen. I think the ambassador, former Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson, our ambassador to NATO, is doing a very good job under very difficult circumstances. Former Congressman Green, head of AID, really trying to continue the marshaling of AID resources to make sure that soft power really does have a presence and a place and a voice at the table.
Paul?
I think standing up to Iran is the right thing to do. May not argue about some of the tactics, but I think confronting them overall as basically a hostile adversary is right. And I think defining the area of strategic interests as not just East Asia and the Pacific, but the whole, they use this term Indo-Pacific region, bringing in India, bringing in the Persian Gulf, I think is right.
We have just 5 minutes, but I do want to make some allowances for the audience questions. Who should I ask this to? How can politicians question Israel and U.S. policy toward Israel without being accused of anti-Semitism? Senator Cardin.
Thank you. You know, we had a long discussion about this. Look, I'm very critical of the United States and Donald Trump, and I love America. You could be critical of Israel and its government and love Israel and have understanding the importance of the strategic and relationship between these two countries, a special relationship that exists since 1948, that's important to the United States. It's the only country in that region that not only shares our values, but we can rely upon for reliable military and intelligence information. It's important for America. So you can have a love for Israel and a respect for the relationship and be critical of the Netanyahu government. That's not difficult. That really is not difficult. So, and Israel is different than the Jewish people. And when you say Jews and Israel together, that in and of itself is a problem. And I recognize that Israel is a Jewish state, but there are Catholic states and there are other, and we don't use that interchangeably. So I just think we believe in a healthy debate, but don't accuse people of certain things because we may disagree on the policies of a particular government.
I got to speak up because I mean, obviously, as the only Republican Jew that happened to have been the leader in the House, I will tell you that what transpired last week in the House of Representatives, very troubling to me as a Jew in America, because you had an instance that gave rise to a real uproar because of several comments, not just one comment, by a newly elected Democratic member from Minnesota. That did connect.
That was wrong.
That did connect support for Israel to some very old anti-Semitic tropes. And that, to me, was the time that the Congress and the House should have stepped up and called out anti-Semitism for what it was and condemned those remarks, and they failed to do so.
I would just have to respond to that. What happened there, those comments were clearly anti-Semitic. And they needed to be condemned, and they were condemned, as they should have been. Now, how the House came together on a resolution, I give Leader Pelosi some credit, because I'll tell you something. As strongly, I'm the special representative on anti-Semitism, the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I've traveled through Europe. I'm on the front lines a lot on anti-Semitic issues. And I couldn't agree more with Eric in regards to those comments. It wasn't one, it was three. And they should have been strongly condemned by all. And I agree with that. But recognize there are some on both the left and right that are trying to use Jews and Israel on a partisan wedge issue. Don't fall trap to that. We have a problem in the Senate where we would like to do some things together, but the majority leader won't let us because he wants to try to create a political win for the Republican Party on this issue. And that's wrong. The support for Israel is so critically important, we should never turn it into a wedge issue. And I'm afraid there's some who do that. But in regards to the comments made by the Congresswoman, outrageous, was condemned by all leaders immediately, as it should have been. One of the things you do to fight anti-Semitism, leaders have to speak out against anti-Semitic conduct. That was, and they did speak out against it, but I don't criticize the manner that Leader Pelosi tried to bring the House together in speaking against the issue.
We're coming near the end of our time, but I would want to ask a final question to each of you, if you could just answer it somewhat briefly, starting with Senator Mikulski. There are a lot of young people in this room, many students at Johns Hopkins attending a great university. What is one thing that they should come away with about what joins all Americans in conducting an honorable, bipartisan, and visionary foreign policy? If you were going to impart one lesson to them before they leave this library, what would it be?
Well, it's not one lesson. You have to engage in the world. You have to know about the world, and you have to know how to help change it. You must engage, and you must engage in processes. And then work with our country to honor our treaties or our agreements. I would say get out there, kids, and get us back into the Paris Agreement. Global warming is a cause that could bring us together and even find the new jobs that we're looking for.
Senator Cardin?
My lesson would be that when America follows its values, it can change the world. Look at what America's leadership meant to the apartheid government of South Africa and bringing down that apartheid system without the use of the military bloodshed. Look what America did when it stood up to the AIDS epidemic through the PEPFAR program and the difference we made globally on the health issue. When we stick to our values, we can change the world for the better.
Eric?
Never ever forget the exceptionalism of America. We have dynamic times right now and things seem to be changing, disruption abounds, but never ever forget this notion that America is not just a country, we are an idea. And we need to stand by that and our founding principles as we look to, and if you are in the position to make policy or to make laws in the future, never ever forget that. That's what we stand for, and let that be your guide in foreign policy.
And Paul?
I think America is the last best hope of freedom in the world. Freedom is under challenge from some very powerful countries and some very ugly movements. It was challenged in the 1930s and in the 1940s and 50s by the Soviet Union. The American cavalry rode to the rescue. There's no one to ride to our rescue if we fail.
I want to just conclude very briefly by not just thanking our panelists and for really coming a great distance to join us today. I want to thank the audience for joining this event. Gary and myself, with the help of Ron and Elizabeth and your team at Johns Hopkins and the Niarchos Foundation, worked for more than 6 months to make this event possible. And I think, just going from one I think superb session to another, what strikes me in hearing voices from across the political spectrum is that we still have a heck of a lot in common. And that is often true about the means, and it's almost invariably true about the goals. And I hope that we can continue this work at other fora, but also at Agora with the help of Johns Hopkins and certainly with the help of all of you. So thank you for being such a wonderful and engaged audience, and we hope we can do it again. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Good to see you. How you doing?